The catalyst 1347. The Mongol army is laying siege to the port city of Kaffa in Crimea, a bustling hub for Italian merchants. But there's a problem. The siege is failing because a terrifying illness is ripping through the Mongol ranks. Soldiers are collapsing, burning with fever, and covered in grotesque black swellings. Their strength is gone. In a moment of desperation, their leader Janib Beg lands on a horrifying idea, what might be one of the earliest acts of biological warfare in history. He orders his men to load their catapults not with stones, but with the plague-ridden corpses of their own dead. One after another, infected bodies are hurled over the city walls. This is the chilling story that comes to us from an Italian notary named Gabriele de Mussi. De Mussi wasn't actually there, and modern historians debate whether it happened exactly this way, or if the plague simply snuck in with rats on trade ships. But what isn't up for debate is the result. This wasn't just an attack on a city. This was the moment a microscopic killer was unleashed on a new continent. It triggered a chain of events so catastrophic, so transformative, that it would not just kill millions, but fundamentally alter the course of human history. It didn't just end an era. It torched the old world, clearing the ground for a new one to be built from the ashes. This is how a single plague didn't just write a new chapter. It rewrote the entire book. The perfect storm. To understand the cataclysm that was about to unfold, we have to meet our antagonist. A bacterium called yeast. For centuries, it lived a quiet life, cycling between fleas and rodents in Central Asia. Humans were mostly just accidental victims. But in the 14th century, a perfect storm of conditions would elevate this tiny organism from a regional pest to a global predator. First, the killer itself. Yersinia pestis is brutally efficient and comes in a few terrifying varieties. The most common is bubonic plague, passed by the bite of an infected flea. The bacteria swarm the nearest lymph node, causing it to swell into a painful, pus-filled lump called a fever, chills, and exhaustion follow. Without treatment, it's deadly. If the infection escapes the lymph nodes, it can cause septicemic plague, a direct infection of the blood. This is what gives the Black Death its name, as it can cause skin and tissue to turn black and die. It was almost always fatal. Finally, and most terrifyingly, if the bacteria reached the lungs, it became pneumonic plague. This form can spread through the air from person to person, just like a cold. Without modern medicine, it's almost 100% lethal. The 14th century world was about to face them all, and humanity had set the stage perfectly for its own devastation. The 13th and early 14th centuries had been good to Europe. The climate was warmer, harvests were steady, and the population boomed. But this growth had a dark side. Cities like Paris, London, and Florence became densely packed, teeming with people living in squalor. Sanitation was non-existent. Waste was just tossed into the streets, attracting legions of black rats, perfect ships for plague-carrying fleas to sail on. On top of this, the good times were ending. By the early 1300s, Europe was tipping into a little ice age. Colder weather caused crop failures and widespread famine. This left the population malnourished, their immune systems weakened, making them incredibly vulnerable to a new disease. Then there was trade. This was the era of the Silk Road and the great maritime republics of Venice and Genoa. For the first time, a vast network connected China, the Middle East, and Europe like a web of arteries. These routes moved silk, spices, and incredible wealth. But they also carried a single rat with infected fleas could hop on a ship in the Black Sea and weeks later scurry down a rope onto a dock in Italy, unleashing the plague on a continent that had no immunity, no understanding of contagion, and was already weak with hunger. Europe wasn't just unprepared, it was primed for disaster. The perfect storm was about to make landfall. The domino effect from Kaffa, the plague didn't just spread, it exploded. The Genoese merchants who escaped the siege took the disease with them. In October 1347, 12 of their ships arrived in the Sicilian port of Messina. Locals were horrified to find the galleys full of dead and dying sailors, their bodies covered in the telltale black butte. The authorities drove the death ships from the harbor, but it was too late. The rats were already ashore. The dominoes were falling. From Messina, the plague consumed Sicily before jumping to the Italian mainland. It hit the great trading cities of Genoa and Venice by early 1348. The engine of Europe's prosperity was now the agent of its doom. Ships carried the pestilence to Marseille, and from there it surged up the Rhine River and overland into Spain. By June it was in Paris. By autumn it crossed the English Channel. Within 5 years, it had reached almost every corner of Europe, from the coasts of the Mediterranean to the fjords of Scandinavia. The speed was terrifying, but the reality on the ground was a nightmare. A Sienese chronicler, Agnolo de Tura, wrote, "People lay ill little more than 2 or 3 days and died suddenly. He who was well one day was dead the next." Agnolo buried all 5 of his children with his own hands. The writer Giovanni Boccaccio described workers digging massive trenches in Florence, in which they laid the corpses as they arrived by hundreds at a time, piling them up tier upon tier as merchandise is stowed on a ship. This was a terror that ripped society apart. Fear of contagion was so total that the healthy abandoned the sick. Parents refused to see their children. Husbands and wives turned away from each other. Priests, terrified for their own lives, denied last rites to the dying. In many places, society simply stopped working. Fields lay unharvested as farmers died, and the entire medieval world ground to a halt. The scale of the death is still hard to wrap your head around. Historians estimate the Black Death killed at least a third, and in many places more than half, of Europe's population. In a world of around 80 million, that's somewhere between 25 and 50 million people gone in under a decade. Some places were hit even harder. The city of Florence may have lost up to 80% of its people. England's population in 1400 was about half of what it was a century earlier. Roughly 1,000 English villages were abandoned and just vanished from the map. This wasn't just a disease. It was a demographic collapse unlike anything in human history. It left a gaping wound in the heart of civilization, a void that would change everything. The world of 1347 was gone, and what rose from the rubble would be unrecognizable. The world remade the Black Death was an unimaginable tragedy, but in its wake, it acted as a brutal and shockingly effective agent of change. By wiping the slate clean, it accidentally shattered the rigid structures of the medieval world and, in doing so, laid the foundations for our own. The plague was the catalyst that brought the Middle Ages to a violent end and helped give birth to the modern era. Let's start with the economy. The medieval economy was built on feudalism, a rigid pyramid. At the bottom were serfs, making up maybe 85% of the population. They were tied to the land, unable to leave without their lord's permission. They worked the lord's fields for free in exchange for a tiny plot of their own. The whole system was based on one simple fact. Land was scarce, but labor was plentiful and cheap. The Black Death flipped that equation overnight. With up to half the population gone, labor was suddenly incredibly scarce and incredibly valuable. For the first time, surviving peasants had leverage. A lord with rotting crops because his workers were dead was a lord in crisis. If another lord offered better terms or, even more radically, actual wages, peasants would just leave. The chains of serfdom began to dissolve in the face of simple market forces. The ruling classes were horrified. In England, they tried to fight back with laws like the Statute of Labourers in 1351, which tried to freeze wages at pre-plague levels, but it was impossible to enforce and just fueled more anger, leading to violent uprisings like the English Peasants' Revolt of 1381. The peasants had a taste of economic power, and they weren't giving it up. The feudal system was broken. A new economy based on cash wages and land rental began to emerge, giving rise to a new, powerful middle class. This economic earthquake triggered a social and political one. The old, three-tiered society of those who pray, those who fight, and those who work was cracking. Social mobility, once nearly impossible, became a reality. A peasant could now dream of owning land or moving to a city to learn a trade. At the same time, the old pillars of authority were shaking. The church, which held almost absolute power, had been helpless against the plague. Its prayers and processions had failed. For many, faith was profoundly shaken. Some turned to extremism, like the flagellants who whipped themselves in public penance. Many others grew critical of the church's wealth and power, planting the seeds that would eventually blossom into the Protestant Reformation a century and a half later. Looking for answers, people also looked for Tragically, this often meant turning on Jewish communities, who were falsely accused of poisoning wells. Horrific massacres swept across Europe, and countless innocent people were murdered. This crisis of faith also hit the nobles and kings. They, too, had failed to protect their people. This loss of prestige, combined with the new economic power of commoners, began the slow erosion of the absolute power of the nobility, paving the way for more representative forms of government. Finally, the plague had a huge cultural impact. The sheer scale of death forced a change in perspective. The medieval mind was focused on God and the afterlife. But for the survivors, surrounded by so much sudden death, life on Earth took on new urgency. This new focus on human experience and achievement is the core of humanism, the intellectual engine of the Italian Renaissance. Some historians argue the shock of the plague, by breaking the old ways of thinking, was a direct catalyst for this cultural rebirth. The plague didn't just kill people, it killed a mindset, allowing the world to be reborn. The scars and the seeds of the Black Death wasn't a one-time event. It left deep, permanent scars on Europe, and its aftershocks were felt for centuries. The plague returned in waves, less severe but still terrifying, all the way into the 18th century. This created a culture obsessed with death, a memento mori, a reminder that life was fragile, visible in the art and literature of the time. But humanity also learned. The total failure of medieval medicine forced a slow turn toward observation, while the real cause of the plague wouldn't be found for another 500 years. Cities in Italy began developing the world's first public health measures. In 1377, the city of Ragusa na Dubrovnik was the first to order arriving sailors to be isolated for 30 days. This was later extended to 40 days, or a quarantino, giving us the word quarantine. It was a radical idea, born from bitter experience. the acknowledgement that a disease could be contagious. And this wasn't the first time a plague had rewritten history. Nearly 800 years earlier, in the 6th century, another pandemic tore through the world. The plague of Justinian was caused by what genetic evidence now tells us was a different, extinct strain of the same bacterium. It erupted in the Byzantine Empire under Emperor Justinian, just as his armies were on the verge of reuniting the old Roman Empire. The plague crippled his empire, killing thousands a day in the capital of Constantinople. It drained the empire's manpower and its treasury. Justinian's dream of a restored Rome was shattered. Some historians argue this weakening of the Byzantine and Persian empires created a power vacuum that helped the rapid expansion of Islam a century later. Even the plague bacterium itself evolved. Recent studies suggest that later strains of Yersinia pestis had genetic changes. One gene, known as PLA, appears to have evolved in ways that might have made the plague slightly less deadly. From the bacterium's point of view, this is a brilliant survival strategy. A disease that kills its host too quickly burns out. A version that lets its host live a little longer can spread farther, ensuring the pathogen's own survival. It's a chilling reminder that as we grappled with the consequences, the enemy was adapting, its own history being written on a timescale we could barely perceive. The echo in our time, so could a single plague rewrite all of history? The evidence is overwhelming. The Black Death wasn't just another historical event. It was a biological reset button for Western civilization. It may have killed up to half the population of Europe, but its real legacy isn't just in the number of victims but in the new world they left behind. It was a force of creative destruction. It vaporized the economic foundation of feudalism, freeing millions and creating the conditions for a modern wage-based economy. It shattered the authority of the church and nobility, empowering individuals and sowing the seeds of the Renaissance and the Reformation. It transformed a rigid, layered society into a more fluid one, where for the first time, moving up in the world was possible on a grand scale. It didn't just change the path of history, it blasted a new one out of solid rock. Without the plague, the world we know today, a world of capitalism, nation-states, and individualism, might have taken centuries longer to appear, if it appeared at all. And the story isn't over. The plague of Justinian, the Black Death, the 1918 flu, and our own recent experience with a global pandemic are all chapters in the same ongoing story. The struggle between human civilization and the microscopic world. We have modern medicine and scientific knowledge our ancestors couldn't dream of, but we are still vulnerable. We've seen how a new virus can shut down the globe, disrupt our lives, and shake our most stable institutions. The story of the Great Plagues is a humbling one. It shows us that for all our power and technology, some of the most powerful forces in history have always been completely invisible. History isn't just driven by great leaders or grand ideas. Sometimes it's driven by a bacterium on the back of a rat, which leaves us with a final, provocative question. What microscopic threat is lurking just over the horizon, waiting for its moment to rewrite the world all over again? If you found this look at the history of pandemics fascinating, you might be interested in our video on the 1918 flu, which you can watch by clicking here. And as always, if you want to support our explorations of history and science, consider subscribing and ringing the bell so you never miss a new story. Thank you for watching.